Yeah, I think one of the places that I would like to start, and I'm going to be talking about the topic title is Unity Without Union Beyond Acronyms. That's not bad. These were given by the folks here. But I'm going to be talking about something that has been mentioned in a variety of ways. I'm going to be talking about a little bit about the formation of the OPC. You've heard Dr. Hart say some things about that with respect to Machen and a few things. I'm going to be focusing on a couple things with respect to the formation of the OPC and its relationship then to the CRC, and a little bit about that whole background and how that broke down ultimately, and then the formation of the URC and some of the issues there. And the question was asked last night by Chuck Meether. Oh, he's laughing about that question that Chuck asked. If you remember his question from last night, if you don't, well, I'm not repeating it. But he asked a question last night about a federative kind of arrangement, and Dr. Hart gave an answer with which I'm quite in agreement in terms of the ecumenical imperative, what we need to be doing. I mean, to sort of bottom line this for you, because we have OP and URC here. This is not to the exclusion of any other groups, but we've got OP and URC. And I'm very, very convicted that we, and this is not my historian's hat, this is a theologian's hat, this is a preacher's hat, that we should work together as much as we can. We should find as much agreement and cooperate. And it's not that I don't think we should do this with others, but I think we particularly, and I'm going to say this, I believe that we have come, and you can see how we get there, so I want to make sure I say this. I believe the OPC and the URC have come to be probably the closest in several certain respects. Interestingly, I think in terms of our ethos, the general life of our church, that we're arguably closer to you. And I'm saying this, and I'm saying this on the air. I don't mind saying this. I think this. I'm prepared to give evidence for this. I think that the OPC and the URC are closer than arguably the OPC and the PCA are. The OPC and the PCA share the same confession, the same form of the Westminster Confession, the Westminster Larger and Shorter Catechisms. The URC has the three forms of unity. But I think in terms of the life of our church, the liturgy of our church, the view of the Lord's Day, many, many sorts of issues, we share a great deal. And I think we have to learn from the URC. I think there are things the OPC has to learn from the URC. I think there are things the URC has to learn from the OPC. So I'm going to be speaking historically and all that, but obviously at this point, I'm also speaking didactically. I'm speaking in a hortatory fashion, even perhaps, encouraging and saying, let's recognize something of this, and let's work together as we can. It's, I think, to our detriment if we let the things that separate us, and there are things that separate us, and I think there are things about which we would probably continue to differ that particularly have to do with polity and matters in that respect. Not so much doctrine. I don't think that there are any core doctrinal issues that really divide us in any significant way. So that means, yes, I believe there is a fairly strong and clear concord between the three forms of unity and the Westminster Standards. I believe that there is such. And, you could ask questions. You could talk about what the apparent differences would be. I think what you have, if I can put it this way, is the difference in terms of the three forms and the Westminster Standards. You have the difference between theology as it is, dogma as it is being set forth by the church more closely at the time of the Reformation, specifically in the 16th century. That's what you have in the Belgic, 1561. The Belgic Confession is it's very close to the Gallican, which is Calvin. The Belgic, when you read the Belgic on the Lord's Supper, which I think is the best statement in any Reformed confession written on the Lord's Supper. I don't disagree with anything in Westminster. I uphold it all in Westminster, but I think the best statement on the Lord's Supper is found in Lord's Day 35. I think this is the clearest statement of the Lord's Supper found in any of the Reformed confessions. you have other things in the Belgic that are just marvelously clear, clearer than they are even in some of the 17th century conventions. Same 1563 that we're celebrating the 450th anniversary of the Heidelberg. We in the OPC, I have a little article, others, John Meether, Chuck's brother, he's the brother of Chuck. Let's say I'm introducing John as the brother of Chuck. This may be the only place where that happens. But article on the Heidelberg. So we want to recognize this joint sort of heritage. And then, of course, as I said, the Dort, what happened at Dort, and both doctrinally and the Legal Church Order became a really foundation for the way Westminster approached things. But I think what you have in those 16th century documents is, you might say, you have that Reformed theology in its freshest expression, just coming right out of the Reformation, and very much influenced by Calvin and that whole continental movement. And what you have in the 17th century, what you have in the middle of the 17th century in the Westminster, is having lived with this Reformed theology and having reflected on this Reformed theology, and there being, you might say, the sort of the maturation of that Reformed theology. So you kind of have early expression and a later expression, but something that is essentially of a piece. I'm not saying there are no discontinuities, but I think those who have argued in the line of Richard Muller and my colleague Cornel Venema or Joel Beakey, some of those brothers have left. There's a student at Joel Beakey. All those folks have argued, and many others. Dr. Hart and myself in our own places and ways, but those men, particularly given their concerns for Calvin and those times, have argued there is this essential continuity between the Calvinists of the 16th century and the Puritans. I mean, they were largely Puritans at Westminster of the 17th century who gave expression there to the theology of the church. And it's in the 20th century especially that you've had figures argue that there's this great discontinuity, particularly that what Westminster did, what the Puritans did in the 17th century was a betrayal of what Calvin did. That Calvin had this wonderful, beautiful thing in some measure, and all of his heirs, all of his successors messed it up and didn't get it right. Karl Barth was one of the chief sort of architects of that approach. And it's something I think that more careful historians have been able to look at and see that, no, that's not the case. So I think it's important to say that theologically. I think it's also helpful to think just from maybe a little different vantage point. And here I'm going to demur a little bit from what my esteemed colleague said in the previous hour. I don't disagree that there are these differences of emphasis, notice my words carefully, between J. Gresham Machen and Abraham Kuyper. I think there are some differences of emphasis, clearly. I think there are some obvious differences. But I think that there is also a sort of continuity there. I don't think that that is as different as it might sound or as it can be made to sound. I think in the late 20th and early 21st century, some of the followers of both of those have exacerbated the differences. Okay, so I think there are those who follow Kuyper who have exacerbated or who have made the transformational, the neo-Calvinist things greater. His successors, certain ones, we could talk about a variety of people. And I think there are arguably those from Machen who have made the distinction a greater one, a separation, which is important that there be a proper understanding of a distinction, I think. But there's also always, in everything we do, in theology, there's always an integration. There has to be an integration point. We're always concerned for the one and the many. Otherwise, we just have oneness that swallows up manyness, or manyness that just disperses any notion of unity. If you don't have unity, you don't have communication. If you just have manyness, you don't have that either. So I'm just concerned that we not overemphasize this, and for our purposes even of ecumenicity, because I think you can find these different emphases on both sides. In other words, I think the URC has clear emphases that would be appreciative of the spirituality of the church and of a proper distinction to be made, as well as some sort of a notion of transformation. On the other hand, I think it's true in the OPC. I think you have very much both of those strains there. My exhortation would be for these strains to try to work better and mutually benefit, like you had in the old side, new side controversy. And I think if you look carefully at that controversy, and you read some of those who have treated that controversy, I think that both sides had something to bring to that, and they came back together. They came back together in 1758, and I think it was a beneficial reunion. I think the reunion of 1869, where Old and New School came back together, was less beneficial because, and Hodge highlighted this, the New School was tolerant. And Hodge was very clear about this. Most of the New School, listen to that carefully, most of the New School were not in doctrinal error explicitly, but they tolerated doctrinal error. And Hodge was concerned that a reunion, an Old and New School being brought back together, would be one in which doctrinal error was tolerated. And that's in fact what happened. That did happen. There was that greater, that concern there. But I think in terms of thinking back to Dr. Hart's talk, and again, I don't disagree that there are these differences. That's the question is, though, where are the points of integration? And see, I think Kuyper is being sensitive when he makes the kind of distinction that he does between the church as institute and the church as organism. That's not new to Kuyper by any means. That language is new to Kuyper. But Augustine made very much the same sorts of distinctions. Calvin made the same sorts of distinctions. The Westminster Confession, not only in chapter 25, and I think if Kuyper was a little confused, it was seeing it just at the level of invisible church. What you have in Westminster is you not only have chapter 25, which talks about, it mentions visible and invisible church, but it's talking about the church there. The title of it, the basic thrust of that is the church, which is the kingdom. But chapter 26 talks about the communion of saints. And the communion of saints is very much expressing the sort of thing. I mean, I agree that Kuyper needed to go on. He didn't know the tradition quite well enough. The communion of saints is very much expressing the sort of thing that Kuyper is expressing when he's talking about the church as organism. I think it very much tracks with that. So when it's said that Kuyper limits the spirituality of the church to the institutionality, or to the church's institution, and he applies spirituality to that, I would be prepared to argue at some length that Hodge applies spirituality to the church's institution. And even, and I was just able to hint at this, but I could even show you things in the writing where Thornwell, and arguably even Stuart Robinson, in one particular debate in the General Assembly, was applied it particularly to the church in a sort of its corporate capacity, but also had a notion of church as organism as well. So I think I would argue that the church as organism is something that is also, that is in the tradition of Presbyterians and of Old School Presbyterians and of Westminster, which is to say then, I think that, again, I appreciate these different emphases. I have begun to read Professor Bratt's book. That is, and I want to read all of that on Kuyper. I'm looking forward to that. I've keep going to other things, including a volume I got to review from Yale on Calvinism from some fellow. Are there any copies of that out there? That new volume on Calvinism? Yeah. So I'm looking forward to that. That's just this summer it came out. So, that's kind of my take. So it's not, it's not that somebody was saying, Pastor Jensen, wanting let's see the differences. I would say I'm thinking a little bit in terms of an emphasis and not wanting to make the division quite as sharp. I would want to see, they're having some different emphases here. They're having some different things because I think, and it is a good question of the continuity in Machen himself between the 1912 Machen and the later Machen. I guess I'm not as convinced that the First World War, I mean, you have a lost generation intellectually and in literature. We all remember that. Gertrude Stein and all that happens with all the litterateurs in the despair of the First World War. And I think Machen really, as he writes his mother, I think at one point he said he's had it up to here with that 100% Americanism. He really sees that in the First World War. Whether that actually shifts his eschatology, maybe, I don't know. That's an interesting thing to say. That whole question of eschatology is a pretty complex one, where the Princetonians were, where Machen was, how it all ends up for everybody. And I think there were some general shifts going on. But I guess from a theological point of view, I'll say this, if anything, if you have an eschatological point of view because you believe that's what the Bible teaches, if you're a-mill, post-mill, I'm an a-mill, okay? But if you're post-mill and a war happens in temporal circumstances and that changes your theology, that's really odd. I mean, wouldn't you just say, well, it's going to work out better? I mean, that's what kind of a faith was that? That's just kind of an odd sort of thing to me. And I understand somebody in the world saying, well, I see it all differently now, but I don't quite understand somebody who holds a theological position, picking up the newspaper and reading something, go, well, I don't hold that theological position anymore. I mean, didn't you hold it? Why did you hold it? So it's an interesting, and I'm an amillennialist, so I have no problem with speaking in those terms. So what do I say all this for? To be contentious? Not particularly, but to say I think that we have a good deal in common. The OPC, I think, is a Reformed church that owes a great debt to Continental Calvinism as well as to Scottish and American Presbyterianism, more than perhaps any other American church that's Presbyterian. These concerns, I think, were brought together at Westminster Theological Seminary in 1929. We've heard something about that, the events leading up to Westminster's formation. Where do we want to go back to? Well, maybe 1914, when J. Ross Stevenson became the president of Princeton. And that's the movement of Princeton away from being a clearly, staunchly confessional institution. At that point, it's really the only remaining staunchly confessional institution of all the American Presbyterian seminaries. All the others have, in some measure or another, gone off their confessional moorings, either into out-and-out liberalism, modernism, or they've become moderate in some fashion. J. Ross Stevenson was a moderate, and you have the moderating of Princeton. B.B. Warfield saw what was going on from the very moment he came. Warfield was very dissatisfied. In fact, he stopped going to faculty meetings. One of my colleagues, when he heard that, said, if I don't like what's going on here, I can just stop going to faculty meetings. That's okay. But when you're that old and you're B.B. Warfield, I guess you can just stop going to faculty meetings. But then this president of Princeton, J. Ross Stevenson, brought forth, it was he, together with others, who brought forth this plan of union of all the churches in 1920 to the General Assemblies. This was a plan to unite, we're not talking simply Presbyterian churches, but churches of every stripe across the board. Not even clearly identifying them in a Trinitarian fashion, Warfield pointed out. So that was a real shot to Machen. Machen saw, that the president now of Princeton, which has been this bastion of confessional Reformed Presbyterian orthodoxy, is now going to do this kind of thing, is going to bring this kind of move before the whole church, and to unite with churches that are not Reformed. What will that mean be about the identity of the Presbyterian Church as a Reformed church? And then you've also heard mentioned, kind of reference without being named, Fosdick's 1922 sermon, Shall the Fundamentalist Win?, which one of the wealthy businessmen in his congregation had printed and sent to pastors everywhere. Sort of, I guess, like what would happen with Robert Schuller's Self-Esteem, the New Reformation. All pastors got a copy of that. All pastors got a copy of Shall the Fundamentalist Win? And again, so Machen, as far as he's concerned, is having the gauntlet is being thrown down. This plan of union, bringing all churches together, sort of ending Presbyterianism as he knew it, as we know it. Shall the Fundamentalists Win? Modernists making their real play here. And you have the Auburn Affirmation that follows, where people are saying things like the virgin birth of Christ, the bodily resurrection, the miracles of Christ, the second coming, the inerrancy of Scripture. These are theories. The virgin birth of Christ is a theory. Maybe she wasn't a virgin. That's one way of looking at it. That was what was being said. And J. Gresham Machen and others are saying no. They were saying no. In 1910, in 1916, in 1923, the General Assembly passed these motions saying, you've got to affirm these things. You've got to affirm the virgin birth, and you've got to affirm the miracles of our Lord and the bodily resurrection of Christ. We've got to affirm these things. Of course, they're affirmed in the confessions. But they're saying we've got to make sure these things especially are affirmed. But don't you just want to say you want to make sure the confessions are affirmed? I mean, it's an interesting thing when you do that. Are you making a confession within a confession? Probably a tactical error on the part of the fundamentalists to go about this the way they did and keep making these motions at these three general assemblies in 10, 16, and 23 saying we have to affirm these particular things. Of course, in the process of all this, in 23, Machen writes Christianity and Liberalism. You've heard about that, where he sees these as two different things. But what happens with all this, all these controversies, these assemblies passing these motions, 10, 16, 23, is it all comes to the General Assembly of 1925, where Charles Erdman is the moderator. You can ask Curtis Moliterno about that. At any rate, this is an inside thing. Charles Erdman is the moderator, and he appoints a commission. It becomes known as the Commission of 1925. To sort of deal with this. In other words, they're all the fundamentalists, the conservatives, the confessionalists. Machen and his gang are at it with what they call the liberals or the modernists, or whatever they're calling them. They're at it, and we want peace in the church, and we want a commission to help bring peace. Well, the commission reports in 27. It takes some time to do its work, and when it reports, it says that the requiring these five fundamentals was unconstitutional because you can't select things out and say this is required from the Constitution. I mean, there's this general requirement of everything. But not only do they say that, and thus the Auburn Affirmation is not put down, if you will. The Auburn Affirmation is not addressed in that way. They also say that Princeton Seminary is going to be reorganized. We're going to reorganize Princeton Seminary. We could talk about the specifics of that. The bottom line effect of the reorganization of Princeton was it's going to be under moderate/liberal control now. In fact, Auburn affirmationists, those who were denying or saying, the virgin birth is a theory, that kind of thing, they're going to be on the board of Princeton. And so this is where Machen and company, Machen has also denied the chair in apologetics. They say, old Princeton is dead. Old Princeton is dead. And they go and they form Westminster Seminary at this point in 29. And so there's a lot involved in all of that. There's as that gets founded, so Westminster is up and running. You have the Hocking Commission of 1932, which publishes this report called Rethinking Missions, which argues that it called for a new way to do missions, cooperatively and not confrontatively. And what they meant by that was we have to stop in missions, we have to stop maintaining and proclaiming the exclusivity of Christianity. You go in and you say, you all need to convert, and if you don't convert, you'll go to hell because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. There's no other way to the Father. And the Hocking Commission says that's not a way to do missions. We need to go in and we need to be nice. And yes, Christianity is kind of the highest expression and form of all this, but let's help them to be good people. Let's be good people with them. And, maybe they become Christians, maybe they don't. But, at the end of the day, we want them to be good people. This is in 1932. If this sounds, I've heard this kind of thing, like, I don't know, on Oprah maybe or something. This sounds familiar. I've heard this somewhere. This is in 1932. And Machen, of course, is livid. You've heard about the formation in 1933 of the Independent Board for Presbyterian Foreign Missions. Well, that wasn't like, Athena from the head of Zeus out of nowhere. Where this came from was because of this kind of thing. Because Robert E. Speer, who was the head of the missions board for the PCUSA, as far as Machen was concerned, didn't take enough action with respect to this. Pearl Buck and others involved in the mission program of the PCUSA. It isn't that Speer said, well, the Hawking Report is great, but there were those in the PCUSA, those in the mission agency who were involved in the Hawking Report. There were those missionaries who thought the Hawking Report was great. And Machen said, look, we're compromising our mission program here. And so the Independent Board for Presbyterian Foreign Missions was founded. And what this led to was in 1934, the General Assembly deliverance of 1934, in which the General Assembly of the PCUSA told Machen and company, all of you have to disband, all of you, particularly you who are ministers, you can have nothing to do with this Independent Board for Presbyterian Foreign Missions. You have to support the mission agencies of this church. To not support the mission agencies of our church is the same, is equivalent to not taking communion in the church. That's a rather remarkable statement, okay? But it's the same as that, and you have to disband. And Machen said, okay, listen, the General Assembly has authority. It has authority, but, and this is, I think, a proper understanding of the spirituality of the church here and the power of the church. The GA, when it gives a deliverance, it needs to have Scripture, it needs to have confession, it needs to have warrant. Machen said, given the circumstances, I think we have warrant to not support the mission agency, the mission board of the church, because it's become corrupted. It's compromised with liberalism. And I don't want to support the mission board of the church. And you can't simply say, don't support this independent board and support this board out of the thin air. You can't give a deliverance like this. In fact, you said in 1910 and 16 and 23, you said from the 25 Commission that the GA couldn't just make a deliverance, and that becomes the law of the church. The 25 Commission did say that. The 25 Commission in 27 said GA deliverances simply don't become the law of the church. They have to be they have to be made part of the confession. They have to be made part of the church order. They have to be biblically reasoned and confessionally reasoned. Machen says none of this is here. And all of a sudden, now a GA deliverance is the law of the church when you're a conservative, when you're a confessionalist and not a moderate or a liberal. So we're going to get you. So that becomes a charge, a series of charges against Machen. He's tried. Ultimately, he's removed from the church. And the OP is started. June 11, 1933, Dr. Machen says, at last we have a true Presbyterian church. Well, the first church to recognize the OPC as a true Presbyterian church, heir to the old PCUSA, was the Christian Reformed Church. We got a telegram. Thank you again for that telegram that you sent us. I think we had to pay the charges. I'm just kidding, okay? That's how we knew it was from no, I'm just kidding, just kidding. No, the Scotsmen are as bad, copper wiring was invented by a Scotsman and a Dutchman fighting over a penny. So the CRC sent a telegram of congratulations to our first GA and gave encouragement to the young new denomination. The CRC was cautious, however, waiting a decade, so this is into the later 40s, before sending the first fraternal delegate, because they were in no small measure wondering how reformed the new church would be. And if it would be willing, you're saying, wait a minute, the CRC was looking at the OPC and saying how reformed are they going to be? Yes, and not without some good reason. Because, now let me just step back and say sort of as the theme of our conference, and there's some features, maybe Dr. Harr will be able to address this more. I'm not really able to right at this point because I've already gone too long. But part of it had to do with the CRC being concerned about how Americanized the church was. And they needed to see whether this Presbyterian church was the accent falling on the American part, if you want to think of it that way? Or was it falling on the theological part, that it's Presbyterian, it's Reformed in its doctrine, it's Presbyterian in its government? So the CRC, I think it's fair to say, from my perspective, others may disagree, seems rightly concerned to sort of look at the OP and say, are they really Reformed or not? Because they had been dealing with an American Presbyterian church. They had been dealing with a mainline Presbyterian church that seemed more interested in the flag at points than it did the confession. Is that a fair way to say that? A clear way to say that? So the CRC is kind of, we'll check you out. They wanted to see, for instance, whether the OPC would take a stand against the lodge, Masonry, and membership in that. And the OP adopted a report to that effect. And they were concerned about that, particularly with respect to American Presbyterian churches in the South. It was not quite as much of a problem in the OP as it would be in the Southern Church. Another thing that helped early on was that Westminster had men like Cornelius Van Til, Ned B. Stonehouse, R.B. Kuyper associated with it and who were also involved with the OPC. So you had these men who had been CRC, been CR ministers, been at Calvin, and now they're at Westminster in Philadelphia, and some of them are members of the OPC. They're ministerial members of the OPC. So this is, you have these family ties, you have these connections, these built-in connections. So, so you got CR folk looking and saying, well, you do have some pretty good Dutch folk in this church. So, maybe they're not that bad. I mean, sort of, but really, you've got that sort of a thing going on there. They're trying to size it all up. In fact, now this got the OP from another angle in trouble. This foreign entanglement, to use George Washington's phrase in his farewell address, led the church, it led the OP to be more interested in being Reformed than American. And that led to a split. At the Third General Assembly, you had in 1936, you had in June and November, you had two assemblies that year in 1936. The third assembly was in May of 37. Now, what's different about that assembly is, as you heard, Dr. Machen died January 1, 37. So you had the first two assemblies, Dr. Machen was there. But the third assembly now, Dr. Machen is gone. And that makes a difference, I think. It makes a difference, at least. Some people that Dr. Machen, just his presence, probably kept somewhat in line. Not that it would have continued to do so, perhaps. I mean, who knows? These are arguable things. But now Machen is gone, and you have people like Carl McIntyre, if you know who he is, rising up here, and he and several leave to form the Bible Presbyterian Synod. And no small part of that whole group that formed the Bible Presbyterian Synod were concerned that the OPC was not sufficiently American. Why? Well, it had Van Til and Stonehouse and Kuyper, people of those kind of names, at the seminary and in the church. It had these Dutch guys around. In fact, Alan McRae had given a speech. He resigned from the board of Westminster over this issue. He resigned over this issue, and he was speaking with faculty in the room, with all of these men in the room, and he said, he voiced his opposition. Alan McRae voiced his opposition. He's going to go into the Bible Presbyterian Synod. He voiced his opposition to what he saw at Westminster and within the OPC as these foreign influences, he called them. And then to make it clear, painfully clear to those there, he said, I don't refer to the Scotsman John Murray, because he's McRae. He's Scottish. So he's like, I'm not talking about the Scotsman, because that's proper Presbyterian, Scottish and American. And it's sort of like, you could think of Ned Stonehouse raising his hand and saying, who are you referring to? I mean, you, Dr. Stone. I mean, that's, wow. I mean, to me, that's just, it's mortifying in every sense of the word. It's what it is, but it's not a happy sort of thing to think about a report, that there would be that kind of ethnic prejudice, really. I mean, I don't know what else to call it. But he objected, and others objected to this sort of foreign influences. But the OPC has always had this. The OPC has always been, and it was so influenced in its early years by Westminster Seminary. Westminster Seminary, just so everybody's clear here, because people, I realize I should say this and people get confused about it, was never the seminary of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church has never had a seminary as such, okay? Just like you folk in the URC. You don't have a particular seminary. Neither does the OPC. Never has. Never has. But for all intents and purposes, certainly in the 30s and 40s and 50s, we can just stop there. We can talk beyond that. But certainly in those first decades, really up to the 70s, in no small measure, Westminster Seminary is the unofficial OP seminary, if we can just put it that way. So that's part of what's going on there. And Westminster saw itself from the beginning self-consciously as Westminster, California. Wasn't called that till more recent times, but we'll just call it that, Westminster Seminary, California, as it's seen itself, as a seminary like Mid-America has seen itself, kind of coming from the other point of view. Mid-America came from the Reformed, but wanted also to say, well, we want to be Presbyterian, just like Westminster saying, well, we're Presbyterian, we're Westminster. There you go, that's what focuses it. But both of those institutions have the three forms of unity. You know, I have to say, do you have to subscribe the three forms at Philadelphia? Okay, it's sort of informally influenced a lot, because you've had people like Stonehouse and so forth, and people like Gaffin who have picked up a lot from, Voss, Ritter Boss, and so forth. So I wasn't sure of that. Westminster, Philadelphia, then, they do not officially faculty. They just subscribe Westminster, not the three forms. But California subscribes to three forms. Obviously, Mid-America subscribes the three forms. So I wonder if we're the only two that do that. I don't know. It would be interesting to hear what Puritan says, if anybody knows. But okay, Westminster, Philadelphia sort of has that in its background, both. And Westminster, California, it's not just, it's explicit, as it's explicit at Mid-America, and perhaps some other places too. But that's I think, a happy cross-fertilization that has occurred over the course of the years between the two traditions, between the Dutch and the Presbyterian. And of course, what this meant for the OPC was that it would pursue Reformed North American and international bodies rather than stateside and international evangelical bodies. In other words, NAPARC, we were willing to be in a North American body of Reformed and Presbyterian churches over against the National Association of Evangelicals, which some other Presbyterian churches that are confessional went into. And similarly, we went into the Reformed Ecumenical Synod rather than the International Council of Christian Churches, which was Carl McIntyre's group of the International Council, which I don't know what all of their planks were, but I know they were against communism. I'm not sure what else, but they were clearly that. Well, you've also heard Dr. Hart mention in 1956 to 72, 72 or 3, depending on a couple things, the OPC and the CRC, so there's this recognition, say in 46, we start fraternal delegates from the CRC, right? 10 years later, a decade later, 56 to 73, the OPC and the CRC engage in talks and seriously contemplate merger. Dr. Hart and Professor Meather chronicle this in Fighting the Good Fight, as Dr. Hart does also in Between the Times. The rise of the relationship is interesting in the 50s, and things are on the upswing probably until about 66 or so. And there was cooperation. What this amounted to was cooperation in home and foreign missions between the OP and CRC, various youth programs, a system of pulpit exchange, and some joint publishing efforts. The demise of the relationship started probably, it's hard to just pinpoint it, but I'm pinpointing it about 66, 67 being particularly the demise. There were concerns before 67, but really that's the downside. And there are these trends towards liberalism that the OP begins stating. I'm going to go ahead and mention this because these are very well chronicled, sort of all of these trends towards liberalism. In a very fine article, there's really very little now, as I'm transitioning over to the URC, that's been written on the URC as a history because it's a very young federation. But there's a good article called The History of the United Reformed Churches in North America, a preliminary sketch by Cornelis Venema, and it's published in the volume Always Reformed, Essays and Honors of W. Robert Godfrey. So, shorthandedly, this is the Festschrift for Bob Godfrey, okay? His Festschrift, these essays honoring him. Dr. Venema has one on the history of the URC that is really quite good. And, of course, he's also talking about in greater detail sort of all the things. He goes back to the 52 purging of the faculty at Calvin, and he just goes through a whole lot of things, the love of God controversy, all these kinds of things if you were CRC, and maybe URC you know about. But if you don't, it's 22 pages here, single space, and it's published in the volume. Daryl, you'll help me think of who. Scott Clark was one of the editors. Were there two editors? Was it Scott? You remember? Somebody else, wasn't it? Well, anyway, Scott Clark was an editor, I'm pretty sure. It's Always Reformed, Essays in Honor of. I mean, the volume has it's a useful volume otherwise, but this is the only place. I mean, somebody here can correct me. There's just that I know that there's something that's sort of printed about the history of the URC. And so there were various trends towards liberalism, concerns about biblical infallibility and creation, continuing concerns over women in office and homosexuality. Union discussions cooled significantly and ended altogether in 72. Ultimately, we broke relations with the CRC, just sort of cutting to the chase here, both denominationally and in NAPARC then. All that happened in the 90s. Though we always maintained closeness with and fondness for those who stood firm in the CRC, many of whom in 1996, perhaps some of you in this room, I don't know all your history, formed the URCNA. The history of OPC-URCNA relations was not originally so warm, particularly either. Some say that the URCNA, and this is some involved in the formation of it, some say that the URCNA was, this is a phrase that has been used, was born to die, if you've heard that phrase used before. That is to say, particularly, to enter into union with the Canadian Reformed Church. So there's some part of the URC that thought, some of those men aren't even in the URC anymore, but that's another matter. Part of the URC that thought that it was born to die and enter into this relationship with the Canadian Reformed Church. Venema refutes this in an essay on the history. In this essay on the history of the URC, he disputes that idea and gives evidence and so forth. So you can read it wherever you come down on that issue. What he says seems pretty convincing. But he also argues that the URC gets charged with, perhaps you've heard this, congregationalism. Well, I think he's right to say that's an inapt charge. That doesn't really make a lot of sense because URC churches are not congregationally controlled. They're governed by the consistory. But Venema also argues that because the church order is drawn in a way that it's not clear of the precise nature of the authority above that of the consistory. Okay, So you have the authority of that of the consistory. It's not clear. Is it advisory? Is it voluntary? Above the level of the consistory. There's some question there. And this is all new. You guys are, I see various ministers here, you're debating through this, working through these issues, and elders working through these issues. Venema does refer to this as a kind of, not congregationalism, he says, but consistorialism, he calls it, where the consistory has this, rule, and it's very clear that that's the case. And he argues here that it tends to isolate the particular churches and keep the federation from concerted action that might give it a stronger sense of unity and identity. So he does have a point of view that mildly comes across here. He's not heavily arguing it, but he is arguing for an approach that would see a greater unity within the federative body, that would give greater, perhaps, definition and identity to even bodies above the consistory. And that would be one of the great differences, if I can say that, between a Reformed polity as you practice it, not necessarily from Dort or a more classic Reformed polity, where the classis has a bit more oomph, but as it's come to be in the URC, because in the OPC, as in all Presbyterian churches, the presbytery is an ongoing, continuing body. In fact, it's there's a certain sense in which it's the locus and center. Ministers hold credentials there, and I don't have enough time to argue, why that is as it is. But it has to do with a whole understanding of a regional church and of an understanding of the church beyond simply the local church. And that's something that we genuinely have some differences on, and that's something I think we could talk about. We may continue to have those differences, but perhaps be able to work together in the ways that Chuck was sort of highlighting for us, that Dr. Godfrey was urging NAPARC. And he originally came out with that. He sort of, I don't really mean this as it's going to sound, he's republished this idea. Some of you will appreciate that. He's republished this idea. He came out with this, my recollection is some years back, more than a decade ago. And I liked it when I first heard it. And I still like it. So I think it's a good idea. So I won't repeat all that was said. It was said last night by Reverend Meether and Dr. Hart. The OPC sought closer relations with the URC sort of from the beginning, but was in a measure held off because of a different model of church union. The URC model appears to have been earlier on, not entirely dissimilar from the Canadian Reform, which was this, that ecumenicity means organic union. And we want relations with folk who want organic union. So early on, there was this very intense sort of working between you all, the URC, and the Canadian Reformed with a view of organic union. I don't know where precisely that stands, but I think it's safe to say that it's not going forward with the same speed and urgency and thrust that it was. I'll just say that. I mean, I don't know where it's going to go, but it doesn't seem to be going forward in quite the same way. And it seems that the URC has been willing to turn to the OPC and say, yeah, we're happy for closer relations with you, even though that doesn't mean organic unity. And you have to understand, we as Presbyterians very strongly believe, and this is part of my whole urging, we can have a great deal of cooperation, we can have a great deal of working together without organic unity. We don't believe that organic unity is mandated, because we keep trying to remember, and let me encourage you with this, and this is something that you could forget in working a lot with the Canadian Reformed Church, but this is a basic Protestant conviction. It's certainly Reformed conviction, that the church in its essence is invisible. The church in its essence, that's not some kind of Gnostic thing, that's not some kind of weird thing. That's basic Protestantism. That's also basic Augustinianism, if you read Augustine on this issue. It really is. The church, in its essence, is invisible. So just maybe that's stirring you up. I mean, that actually shouldn't even be a controversial statement among us. All Reformed people, our confessions teach this. They don't put it in those words, but that's certainly the case about the church. And so that's part of the reason, we have unity in Christ. All those who are in Christ have unity in Him. So, well, I can't work with you because I'm not in precisely the same federation. Oh, come on. We don't have to be. We don't have to be. We can work together as churches and work closely together. We're doing that in the Psalter hymnal. And I think it's going well. Are there differences coming out? Yes, of course. Now see, here's one of the ironies. Let me just end with what we have to learn from you. Presbyterians historically, particularly Scottish Presbyterians, either sang exclusively Psalms or predominantly Psalms. Now, there's like several hours of debate there, but I think that's fair to say. They sang exclusively or predominantly Psalms. In America, part of the Americanization, that has so fallen into disuse, even in the OPC. There are many OP churches, certainly many PCA churches, that either don't self-identifiedly sing Psalms or they just sing very few Psalms. Very, very few Psalms. You all have had a great tradition of psalm singing and hymn singing. I think there is a continuing rich tradition of hymn singing, so I think we could help you out with that, but I think you can help refocus us on some of this in terms of psalm singing. I think that's a great thing. But it's interesting. I mean, we have this whole tradition of the regulative principle in a particular way and all this. We have this tradition of psalm singing, but in practice, you do it more. It's similar on the Sabbath. I don't think you can get, and I hope this will be watched, and people ask me, well, what do you think about Westminster on the Sabbath? I think the Westminster Confession goes as far as you could possibly think to go on the Sabbath. It's hard to think about going any further than their statements. I think some of their statements are misunderstood. And I'm not saying I disagree with their statements. I subscribe to those statements. But this is to say, we as Presbyterians have, in terms of our theory and our theology, a very high view of the Lord's Day. URCs, as confessional, historic churches, very dedicated to this, you have, in practice, a higher view of the Lord's Day than we do in practice. We have a higher view in theory. The Heidelberg or the Belgic don't have that high of a view. It doesn't express that kind of view of the Lord's Day. But you have a higher view in your practice of the Lord's Day in general than American Presbyterian does of the Lord's Day. Similarly, in terms of singing psalms, and I'll even put it this way, in terms of having, again, I'm obviously showing certain preferences, but a healthy liturgy, some variation of a Genevan liturgy. Whereas there are some Presbyterian churches that it's almost like the Ephesians Christians, they haven't really even heard that there is a liturgy. Now that may not be fair to say completely. But there are some Presbyterian churches that are very weak in terms of the liturgy. It's not generally a problem with Reformed churches. You're vigorous in this. And I think this is something you have to offer the whole American church. I think it's something you have to offer the American nation in the sense that you want to plant churches, you want to preach the gospel. My great encouragement, as I've not only been fraternal delegate to the classes, but twice I've been synodical delegate. And I was at the Synod 2012 in Nyack. And I said these things to the brothers there. And I said, I want to encourage you what God has done for you and among you. And you need to be planting churches because we need this. We need this. We need more URC churches because we need what it is you have to offer. We need these solid views of worship, of liturgy, of song and worship, of the Lord's Day. This is important stuff. And it'll be for the renewal, for the betterment of the American church. You want to talk about the church in America. We need more of that and less of, okay, I'll just say it, Joel Osteen. Okay. I haven't been mentioning names, but there's a name I'll just mention. We need less of that. And we need more of solid, reformed doctrine, worship, teaching, life. So, I think this is something we can work together on. So that's my talk.